The horrific story of a woman giving birth during a tornado. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sky was unusually still that afternoon, draped in a dark, ominous hue that hinted at something unnatural. A heavy silence had settled over the small farmhouse, broken only by the distant chirping of birds and the occasional creak of old wooden beams. Mary sat alone on the edge of her bed, clutching her swollen belly as if it held her entire world. She was 8 months pregnant, close enough that the baby could come any day now. Her husband, Jack, had left early that morning to check on his parents' property a few towns over, leaving her with a promise to return before nightfall. "You'll be fine, Mary," he'd said, kissing her forehead softly. "Just rest and call me if you need anything." Mary had smiled, though her chest carried the subtle weight of unease. Something about the stillness in the air made her feel restless. She glanced out the window, staring at the endless fields that stretched toward the horizon. The clouds had begun to cluster into dark, angry shapes, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns. A sudden kick from the baby startled her. "You feel that too, huh?" she whispered, rubbing her belly with trembling hands. "Something's coming." The wind picked up outside, whistling softly at first, then growing louder, like a whisper turning into a shout. The curtains billowed inward, and Mary frowned, standing to close the window. That's when she heard it, the faint, distant sound of a siren. Her heart skipped a beat. The sirens meant one thing in this part of the country: a tornado was forming. Mary's breath caught as she stared out the window again. The once distant clouds had thickened into a rolling wall of black, and the wind had grown sharp, tugging at the trees until they swayed violently. She stumbled back from the window, her mind racing. "The shelter," she muttered to herself. "I need to get to the shelter." The storm cellar was outside, a few dozen feet from the back door. Jack had reinforced it years ago, and it had always been their safe haven during bad weather. But today, Mary wasn't sure she could make it. Her belly was heavy, her legs felt unsteady, and every step she took was slower than the last. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the house to its foundations. Mary grabbed her phone from the nightstand and dialed Jack's number with trembling fingers. It rang twice before going straight to voicemail. "Jack, it's me," she said, her voice shaking. "There's a storm. A big one. I'm trying to get to the cellar, but I don't know. Just call me back, okay?" The wind screamed outside, rattling the windows with a force that made Mary's heart pound. She grabbed a blanket from the bed, draping it over her shoulders as she made her way toward the back door. Each step felt like wading through mud, the weight of her body and the rising panic pulling her down. She pushed the door open, and the storm hit her like a wall. The air was alive with debris, leaves, dirt, and broken twigs flying in every direction. The sky above was an unnatural green, streaked with flashes of lightning that illuminated the swirling black funnel in the distance. Mary froze, her breath catching in her throat. The tornado was massive, a monstrous column of wind and fury that seemed to consume the sky itself. It was moving fast, tearing through the fields in a relentless path toward her home. "No," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "No, no, no." She stumbled forward, clutching her belly as the baby kicked again, harder this time. She could feel it, the pain, the pressure building deep inside her. "Not now," she begged silently. "Not here." Mary staggered toward the storm cellar, her feet slipping on the muddy ground. The wind roared in her ears, pulling at her hair and the edges of her blanket. She could see the cellar door now, just a few feet away, but the ground trembled beneath her as the tornado grew closer. Suddenly, a deafening crack split the air. Mary turned just in time to see a large tree snap in half, its trunk splintering like a matchstick. The tree crashed to the ground with a thundering boom, blocking her path to the cellar. Mary screamed, stumbling backward as the ground shook. The tornado was nearly on top of her now, its winds howling like a wild beast. She turned and ran back toward the house, tears streaming down her face as she fought to stay upright. The back door slammed shut behind her as she stumbled inside, gasping for breath. The house groaned and creaked around her, the walls shuddering with the force of the wind. Mary sank to her knees in the living room, clutching her belly as another sharp pain ripped through her. She cried out, her body trembling. The baby was coming, there was no stopping it now. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't let this happen here." The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Outside, the tornado roared like a freight train, the sound so loud it drowned out everything else. Mary crawled toward the center of the room, dragging the blanket with her. She remembered what Jack had told her once. If you can't make it to the cellar, get low and cover yourself. The safest place is the middle of the house. She pressed her back against the sofa, wrapping the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Her body shook with pain, each contraction coming harder and faster than the last. The storm rattled the walls, tearing shingles from the roof and sending shards of glass flying as the windows shattered one by one. Mary squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing as she rocked back and forth. "You're okay," she whispered, as much to herself as to the baby. "Okay. We're going to be okay." The wind roared louder, and Mary knew the tornado was on top of them now. The pressure in the air changed, like the world itself was holding its breath. She opened her eyes just in time to see the ceiling above her begin to peel away, the wooden beams splintering as they were sucked into the swirling void above. "No!" she screamed, shielding her head with her arms as debris rained down around her. The house groaned and shuddered, its walls bending and twisting under the force of the wind. Mary's body tensed as another contraction hit, the pain blinding and all-consuming. She screamed, clutching her belly as the storm raged around her. She could feel the baby moving, pushing as though it, too, was fighting to escape the chaos. "You can do this," she sobbed, her voice hoarse. "You're strong. You're so strong." The storm's roar grew deafening, a sound so primal and terrifying it seemed to come from the earth itself. Mary curled into herself, the blanket barely protecting her from the shards of wood and glass flying through the air. "Hold on," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Just hold on." The roar of the tornado surrounded Mary like a living monster, its winds tearing through the house with unimaginable force. She squeezed her eyes shut, her body racked with pain as another contraction ripped through her. The baby was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Debris rained down around her, splinters of wood, shards of glass, pieces of furniture tossed like toys. The blanket she had wrapped around herself was her only shield, but it felt laughably small against the fury of the storm. "Please," Mary cried out, her voice hoarse, though no one could hear her over the deafening roar. "Please let me get through this." She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath ragged and shallow. Another contraction hit, sharper this time, and Mary cried out again, curling into herself. She pressed her back against the sofa, desperately trying to ground herself against the chaos. In that moment, her survival instinct kicked in. If the baby was coming now, she couldn't panic. She had to focus. "You're okay," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking but determined. "You're okay, and so is the baby. We'll get through this." She adjusted the blanket, tucking it under her legs to create a soft surface as best as she could. Her body ached, her muscles straining with the effort of labor. The fear coursing through her veins was like ice, but beneath it was something stronger, resolve. The baby kicked again, and Mary groaned, leaning back against the torn-up couch cushion. She forced herself to breathe through the pain, deep, slow breaths, even as the storm screamed louder, drowning out everything else. "Jack," she whispered brokenly, tears sliding down her face. She thought of her husband, of the promise he'd made to return before nightfall. "Where are you?" she thought, her heart aching. "I need you." The tornado raged on outside, shaking the very foundations of the house. Mary opened her eyes and gasped in terror as the front door was ripped from its hinges and sent flying across the room, crashing into the far wall. The wind howled through the open doorway, a bitter, angry force that made the temperature drop instantly. Mary hunched over, shielding her belly with her arms, trying to block out the freezing wind. Her hair whipped around her face, sticking to her damp skin. The contractions were closer together now, relentless, like waves crashing over her with no time to catch her breath. "Come on, baby," she whispered, rocking slightly as she worked through the pain. "I need you to hold on just a little longer." Suddenly, Mary felt a sharp, overwhelming pressure. She cried out, her body trembling. She knew what this meant. The baby was ready. "No, no, no," she sobbed, panic threatening to consume her. But there was no stopping it now. She could feel the baby pushing, her body taking over in a primal, unstoppable force. "Breathe," she told herself, gasping for air as she gripped the edge of the sofa. "You have to do this." With every ounce of strength she had left, Mary bore down, tears streaming down her face as she pushed. The pain was blinding, a force so intense she thought it might tear her apart. Outside, the tornado roared like a freight train, the sound so loud it rattled in her bones. The walls shuddered, the floor shook, and the ceiling groaned as though it might collapse at any moment. Mary screamed as she pushed again, her body trembling, the effort leaving her breathless and dizzy. She could feel the baby moving now, could feel life pressing forward even as the world seemed to be falling apart around her. "You're almost here," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "Come on, baby. You can do this." Another contraction hit, and Mary let out a strangled cry, summoning strength she didn't know she had. She pushed with everything in her, the storm raging, the house shaking, the wind howling like a monster outside her door. And then, as if the universe itself paused, it happened. The cry of a newborn baby split through the chaos, cutting through the roar of the tornado like a beam of light piercing the dark. Mary collapsed back against the sofa, her body trembling with exhaustion. The sound of her baby's cries filled the room, raw and loud, a beautiful contrast to the destruction all around them. "I did it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she reached down, lifting the tiny, squirming baby into her arms. "We did it." The baby's cries softened as Mary held them close, her trembling hands smoothing over their tiny head. "You're okay," she whispered, pressing her lips to the baby's forehead. "You're safe now. I've got you." For a moment, the world around her seemed to fall away. The storm still raged, but all Mary could hear was the sound of her baby breathing, the soft rise and fall of their tiny chest. She cradled them close, rocking slightly as she whispered soothing words into their ear. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the tornado began to fade. The roar of the wind softened, the shaking of the house subsided, and the howling fury turned into a distant rumble. Mary didn't move, still holding her baby tightly against her chest. She couldn't bring herself to look up, couldn't bear to see what the storm had left behind. The silence that followed was deafening. After what felt like hours, Mary lifted her head, her gaze falling on the room around her. It was unrecognizable. The roof above her had partially collapsed, and the front wall of the house was gone, leaving a gaping hole that opened into a landscape of utter devastation. The once beautiful fields outside were now unrecognizable, littered with debris, broken trees, splintered wood, pieces of homes that had been torn apart. Dark clouds still lingered in the distance, streaked with flashes of lightning, but the tornado itself was gone. Mary's chest heaved as she looked at the destruction, the weight of everything crashing over her at once. She was alive. Her baby was alive. But the world they knew was gone. Her baby stirred in her arms, letting out a soft whimper. Mary looked down at them, her heart swelling with a mix of relief, exhaustion, and overwhelming love. "You're okay," she whispered, brushing her fingers over the baby's tiny cheek. "We're okay." She sat there for what felt like hours, rocking her baby as the silence settled around them like a heavy blanket. She thought of Jack, praying that he was safe, praying that he was on his way back to her. And then, faintly, she heard it, the sound of distant voices. Mary's head shot up, her breath catching in her throat. She strained to listen, her heart pounding. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the sound of footsteps crunching over debris. "Help!" Mary screamed, her voice raw and hoarse. "We're here! We're here!" Moments later, a man appeared in the doorway, or what was left of it. He wore a reflective vest and a helmet, a flashlight clutched in his hand. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of Mary sitting on the floor, her baby cradled in her arms. "Ma'am," he shouted, rushing toward her. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Mary let out a sob, her body shaking with relief. "We're okay," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're alive." The man knelt beside her, pulling a blanket from his bag and draping it over her shoulders. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice filled with kindness. "We've got you." More people began to arrive: rescue workers, neighbors, strangers who had come to help. Mary barely registered their voices as they worked to lift her onto a stretcher, carefully bundling her baby in a clean blanket. As they carried her outside, Mary looked up at the sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie calm. The first rays of sunlight were beginning to break through the dark clouds, casting a golden glow over the devastation. Mary held her baby close, pressing her lips to their soft forehead. "We're safe," she whispered. "You and me, we're going to be okay." In that moment, as the sun rose over the broken landscape, Mary knew one thing for certain: they had survived. Against all odds, they had made it through the storm. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. Mary lay in the ambulance, the rhythmic thump of the wheels over debris calming her in a strange way. The bright red and blue lights danced across the shattered remains of her neighborhood. She clutched her newborn tightly to her chest, unwilling to let go. A paramedic, a kind-faced woman with soft brown eyes, worked quietly beside her, checking her vitals. "Your baby's strong," the paramedic said gently, glancing at the infant swaddled in a clean blanket. "A fighter. Just like you." Mary tried to smile, though her lips trembled. Her body was still shaking from exhaustion, her muscles weak and aching. The terror she had felt during the storm lingered in her chest, a phantom pressure that wouldn't let her breathe normally. "Do you know how long the tornado lasted?" she asked hoarsely, her voice barely more than a whisper. The paramedic paused, glancing up at her. "About 10 minutes. But it felt longer, didn't it?" Mary nodded, swallowing hard. 10 minutes. In just 10 minutes, her entire world had turned upside down. The house she'd built a life in with Jack was gone. The nursery she'd spent months preparing for the baby had been reduced to splinters and dust. But they were alive. "Your husband is on his way," the paramedic added softly, as though reading Mary's mind. "We were able to reach him. He's okay." Relief washed over Mary so suddenly that tears filled her eyes. "He's safe?" "Yes," the paramedic assured her. "He's meeting us at the hospital." Mary closed her eyes, a silent prayer of gratitude rising from her chest. The exhaustion weighed heavily on her now, but she refused to let herself sleep. She had to keep her baby close. She had to see Jack. Hours later, Mary woke to the sound of quiet voices and the soft beeping of monitors. The fluorescent lights above her were harsh, but they were nothing compared to the overwhelming darkness of the storm she had just survived. She blinked slowly, adjusting to her surroundings. The hospital room was small but clean, the walls painted a soft, soothing blue. Beside her, in a small hospital bassinet, her newborn slept peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. The sight of him made Mary's heart ache with love and relief. A soft knock on the door startled her. She turned her head to see Jack standing in the doorway, his face pale and streaked with dirt. His clothes were disheveled, and his hair was wild, as though he'd been running for hours. "Mary," he breathed, his voice breaking as he stepped into the room. "Jack." In an instant, he was at her side, dropping to his knees and taking her hand in his. Tears spilled down his cheeks as he pressed his forehead to her knuckles, his shoulders shaking. "I thought I lost you," he choked out, his voice hoarse. "I tried to get back to you, but the roads, they were blocked. I couldn't." Mary reached out with trembling fingers, brushing his hair back. "We're okay," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're both okay." Jack lifted his head, his gaze falling on the sleeping baby in the bassinet. His face crumpled with emotion, and he leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to Mary's forehead. "You're the strongest person I know," he whispered. He turned to the bassinet, his hands shaking as he reached down to pick up the baby. The infant stirred but didn't cry, his tiny hands curling into fists as Jack held him for the first time. "Hey there, little guy," Jack murmured, his voice soft and reverent. "You don't know it yet, but you've got the bravest mom in the world." Mary smiled weakly, watching the love and wonder in Jack's eyes as he looked down at their son. For a moment, the world felt whole again. "What should we name him?" Jack asked, his voice quiet. Mary hesitated, then whispered, "Gale?" Jack blinked, looking at her with surprise. "Gale?" She nodded slowly. "It's a strong name. A reminder of what we survived." Jack's lips trembled, and he looked back down at the baby with tears in his eyes. "Gale," he murmured, his voice filled with love. "It's perfect." In the days that followed, Mary's story began to spread. What had happened to her was nothing short of a miracle, and the local news stations were quick to pick up the tale. "Woman gives birth during tornado, defies the odds," read the headline on one website. "Against all odds, a mother and her baby survived the storm of a lifetime," declared another. Journalists called the hospital, hoping to speak to Mary and share her story. At first, she refused, overwhelmed by the attention and still grappling with the trauma of what she had endured. But as she sat in the hospital room with Jack and baby Gale, she realized something important. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It was a story of survival, of resilience, and of hope. A week after the tornado, Mary agreed to speak with a reporter from the local news. They met at the hospital, where the reporter, a kind woman named Angela, set up her camera in the quiet room. Jack sat just off to the side, holding Gale while Mary sat in a chair, her hands folded in her lap. "Mary, first of all, I want to say how honored I am to share your story," Angela began softly. "The whole community is in awe of your strength." Mary smiled faintly, though her hands still trembled. "Thank you." Angela leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Can you tell us about that day? What you were thinking as the storm hit?" Mary took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "At first, I didn't know how bad it was going to be. The sirens went off, and I knew I had to get to the shelter, but..." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "I couldn't make it. The storm was too fast." Angela nodded, her expression encouraging. And then, Mary's gaze drifted to Gale, sleeping peacefully in Jack's arms. "I knew the baby was coming. Right in the middle of it all, the wind, the noise, the fear, I realized there was no stopping it. I had to keep going. I had to survive." For him, Angela's eyes glistened with tears. "What gave you the strength to keep going?" Mary smiled softly, her voice steady. For my baby, for Jack, for the life we were building." When you're in a moment like that, when everything feels like it's falling apart, you find strength you didn't know you had. You don't think about the storm or the danger, you just fight to keep going. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, and by the end of it, Angela was visibly moved. "Thank you for sharing this with us," she said softly, reaching out to squeeze Mary's hand. "Your story is going to inspire so many people." The news segment aired that evening, and it spread like wildfire. People across the country watched in awe as Mary recounted her ordeal, her courage shining through every word. Messages of support poured in emails, letters, and social media posts from strangers who had been touched by her story. "You're a hero," one message read. "You proved that nothing is stronger than a mother's love." Another said, "Your story gave me hope. If you can survive that, I can get through anything." The messages filled Mary's heart with warmth. She hadn't set out to be anyone's hero, she'd just done what she had to do. But knowing that her story had helped others made the pain of that day feel a little less heavy. A month after the tornado, Mary and Jack stood on the empty lot where their home had once been. The ground was littered with debris, though much of it had been cleared away by volunteers and cleanup crews. "We'll rebuild," Jack said softly, wrapping an arm around Mary's shoulders. Mary looked down at baby Gale, who slept soundly in her arms. She smiled faintly, the wind brushing her hair gently across her face. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "We will." As they stood there together, surrounded by the remnants of what had been, Mary realized that the storm hadn't destroyed everything. It had taken their house, their possessions, and their sense of safety, but it hadn't taken their love, their hope, or their strength. And as she looked at her son, she knew one thing for certain: they would rise again. Together. The wind was gentle now. Soft, cool breezes whispered through the empty lot where Mary, Jack, and baby Gale stood. It was the same wind that had once howled like a monster, tearing apart their world. But today, it carried no malice. It felt like a promise. Jack held Mary close, his hand resting gently on Gail's back. The baby stirred slightly in his blanket, a soft sigh escaping his lips before he drifted back into peaceful sleep. "We'll make this home again," Jack said, his voice quiet but resolute. Mary nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the land seemed to stretch endlessly. The tornado had left scars on the earth, on the community, and on her heart. But it had also uncovered something she hadn't expected: resilience. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the stillness. Mary turned to see a white truck pulling up near what had been their driveway. The door swung open and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, waving as he approached. "Mary," he called, his voice warm and familiar. "David," Jack replied, a smile spreading across his face. David was Jack's oldest friend and the closest thing to a brother he had. He owned a construction company in the next town over and had been one of the first to call after the tornado hit. David reached them, clapping Jack on the back and giving Mary a gentle nod. "I thought I'd stop by and see the place," he said, glancing around at the empty lot. His smile softened. "I know it's hard to look at it now, but we're gonna get you back on your feet. I brought a team with me. They're ready to help clear the rest of this debris and get started as soon as you're ready." Mary blinked, surprised. "David, you don't have to do that." David shook his head firmly. "Of course I do. This is what community's about. When one of us gets knocked down, the rest of us help them back up." He turned to Jeff. "I already pulled some designs for new homes. Modern, durable, with tornado shelters built right in. We'll rebuild stronger this time." Jack squeezed Mary's hand, his eyes full of gratitude. "You have no idea what this means to us, David." David shrugged, flashing a grin. "It's what friends are for." Over the next few weeks, the lot began to transform. Volunteers from all over the town, friends, neighbors, and even strangers, showed up every day to help clear the debris. Trucks carried away broken boards and twisted metal. Children handed out bottles of water, their faces smudged with dirt but glowing with pride as they worked alongside the adults. Mary spent much of her time sitting on a folding chair under a pop-up tent, baby Gail cradled in her arms. People would stop by to check on her, offering words of comfort and kindness. "You're an inspiration," one woman said, kneeling beside Mary with tears in her eyes. "We saw your story on the news. You're stronger than I could ever be." Mary smiled faintly, adjusting Gail's blanket. "I don't think it's about being strong. You just find a way to keep going." The woman nodded, squeezing Mary's hand before walking back to the worksite. Mary watched the activity with a mix of awe and gratitude. She'd always known their small town was close-knit, but seeing everyone come together like this, to rebuild, to heal, made her heart swell. One afternoon, Jack appeared beside her, sweat streaking his face as he crouched down to kiss Gail's forehead. "You should see it, Mary," he said, his voice filled with hope. "The foundation's going in today. It's starting to look real." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe it's happening so fast." Jack smiled softly. "When people care about you, they'll move mountains." Or in this case, tornado debris. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the new house began to take shape. Mary and Jack worked alongside the construction crew when they could, sanding floors, painting walls, and picking out fixtures for their new home. It was hard work, but it was healing too. Each brushstroke, each nail driven into place, was a step toward reclaiming what the tornado had stolen. Baby Gail grew stronger with each passing day. He was a happy, curious baby, always watching the world with wide, thoughtful eyes. Every time Mary looked at him, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. "You're our miracle," she whispered to him one afternoon as she rocked him to sleep in a borrowed crib. "You gave me the strength to fight through the storm." Jack overheard her, pausing in the doorway to watch them. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply walked over and wrapped his arms around both of them, holding them close. By spring, the house was complete. It wasn't the same as their old home, it was better. The new house was sturdy and bright, with large windows that let in plenty of sunlight. In the basement, there was a reinforced storm shelter stocked with supplies. They wouldn't be caught off guard again. The town held a small gathering on move-in day, with tables set up on the front lawn covered in food, drinks, and flowers. People laughed and hugged, celebrating not just the completion of the house but the strength of a community that had come together in the face of disaster. Mary stood on the porch, holding Gail on her hip as she looked out over the crowd. Jack stood beside her, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. David stepped forward, raising a glass of lemonade. To Mary, Jack, and baby Gail, he said loudly, his voice carrying over the chatter. "You've shown us what it means to fight through the darkest storms and come out stronger on the other side. This house is proof that nothing, not even a tornado, can tear us apart when we stand together." The crowd erupted into cheers, clapping and raising their glasses. Mary blinked back tears as she looked out at the familiar faces, the same people who had picked up shovels and hammers, who had brought meals, who had held her hand and told her she wasn't alone. "Thank you," Mary said softly, her voice shaking with emotion. "Thank you for everything. We couldn't have done this without you." Jack grinned, looking out at the crowd. "And you're all welcome to stop by any time, as long as you bring food." Laughter rippled through the crowd, the light-hearted moment lifting the last lingering shadows of that dark day. That night, after the guests had gone home and baby Gail was sound asleep in his new nursery, Mary and Jack sat together on the porch, watching the stars. The air was calm, the breeze soft and warm against their skin. "You did it," Jack said quietly, breaking the silence. "You saved him. You saved yourself. And you gave us this second chance?" Mary looked over at him, her expression thoughtful. "I think we saved each other," she said softly. "When the storm was at its worst, all I could think about was you. And Gail, you kept me going." Jack reached over, taking her hand in his. "We're stronger now," he said. "And we'll make sure Gail grows up knowing how strong his mom is." Mary smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. For the first time in months, she felt truly at peace. The tornado had taken so much from them, but it hadn't taken everything. It hadn't taken their love. It hadn't taken their future. And as they sat there together, under the quiet night sky, Mary knew they would be okay. The storms would come again, they always did. But now they were ready. And no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The night was still as Mary rocked Gail to sleep, his tiny body snug against hers, his breath soft and steady. Outside the window, the gentle rustle of leaves sounded like a lullaby, a stark contrast to the violent winds she still dreamed about. She found herself staring at the horizon, where the dark silhouette of the land stretched on endlessly. Every night since the tornado, Mary had a habit of pausing, watching the sky as if expecting it to roar back to life with fury. "Is this just how it's going to be?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone. Jack's voice startled her from the doorway. "What do you mean?" Mary glanced over her shoulder, smiling faintly as he leaned against the frame, a mug of tea in his hands. "I mean, you're feeling like this. Every time the wind picks up, every time I hear a noise outside, I freeze. My heart starts pounding, and it's like I'm back there all over again. In that room. In the storm." Jack stepped forward, crouching in front of her. "Mary, you went through hell?" He reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. "Nobody gets through something like that and feels fine overnight. You're healing. It's going to take time." Mary nodded, her gaze dropping to Gail, who stirred slightly before drifting back into deep sleep. "I just want to feel normal again." Jack smiled softly. "You will. I promise. But you don't have to rush. And you don't have to do it alone." His words lingered with her long after Jack had gone back to bed. Mary sat quietly for a while, holding Gail, listening to the hum of the house around her. "You don't have to do it alone." The next morning, Mary stood in the kitchen sipping coffee as sunlight streamed through the new windows. It was a rare morning of quiet. No volunteers, no reporters, just peace. She looked around, taking in the warmth of her rebuilt home. Fresh paint, strong walls, a shelter beneath their feet. For the first time in a long while, she let herself breathe. Jack entered, holding his work gloves in one hand and a hammer in the other. "David's crew is helping rebuild the town square today. I'll be over there for a few hours." Mary turned to him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "They're still rebuilding downtown?" "Yeah," Jack replied, pulling on his gloves. The tornado didn't just hit us, you know. It tore apart half the community, businesses, schools, homes. But people are stepping up. You'd be amazed how much progress they've made. Mary set down her coffee mug. Can I come with you? Jack blinked, surprised. You want to come? She nodded. I think it's time I got out of the house. Besides, maybe helping rebuild will help me feel normal again. The downtown square had been unrecognizable after the tornado, a scene of devastation and heartbreak. Buildings were reduced to rubble, windows shattered, and businesses destroyed. But as Mary stepped out of the truck that morning, what she saw instead was hope. Volunteers moved in organized waves, hammering, sweeping, painting, and carrying supplies. The air buzzed with determination and purpose. Looks like an army, Mary said softly, watching the crowd. Jack grinned. Pretty much. David's running the show. He's over there by the hardware store if you want to say hi. Mary nodded and began walking, clutching Gale in his sling against her chest. She passed groups of people, young and old, working side by side. Teens shoveled debris into wheelbarrows. Older men replaced broken bricks on a corner building. A group of women painted the exterior of what looked like an old bakery. Everywhere she looked, people were rebuilding, not just the buildings, but each other. David spotted her first, a grin spreading across his dirt-smudged face as he approached. Mary, he called, wiping his hands on a rag. I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to be here, Mary replied with a small smile. But I wanted to help. David's expression softened. We're glad to have you. He motioned toward the bakery. The owner's been having a tough time getting this place fixed up. Could use a hand with painting if you're up for it? Mary glanced at the bakery, its walls halfway painted in a cheerful yellow. The sight of it stirred something inside her, a quiet determination. I'd like that, she said. Mary spent the day working alongside a group of women she'd never met before, but who welcomed her as if they'd been friends for years. As they painted, they shared stories about where they'd been during the tornado and what they'd lost. Some had lost homes. Others had lost businesses. One woman, a widow named Clara, had lost the small garden she'd tended to for over 30 years. But we're still here, Clara said firmly, wiping sweat from her brow. And that's what matters. Mary paused, holding the paint roller midair. We're still here. The words struck a deep chord in her. By the end of the afternoon, the bakery's exterior gleamed in the sunlight, a cheerful yellow that seemed to defy the darkness the tornado had brought. Clara patted Mary's shoulder as they packed up for the day. You did good work today, she said softly. You've got a strength about you, Mary. Don't lose that. Mary smiled, brushing a smudge of yellow paint off her jeans. Thank you, Clara. I needed this. Clara's eyes twinkled. Sometimes the best way to heal is to help someone else. That evening, Mary sat on the front porch with Jack, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The day had left her sore and exhausted, but for the first time since the storm, she felt lighter. Jack leaned back in his chair, sipping a cold drink. How'd it feel to be out there today? Mary smiled softly, the faint smell of fresh paint still lingering in her mind. It felt good. Really good. Jack nodded, a proud smile tugging at his lips. You're amazing, you know that? Mary laughed quietly, shaking her head. I don't feel amazing. I just feel like me again. That's amazing enough, Jack said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. As they sat there together, baby Gale sleeping soundly in his crib inside, Mary looked out over the land that had once been littered with destruction. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was better. The house, the town, herself, they were all healing, piece by piece. In the months that followed, Mary became a regular fixture in the rebuilding efforts. She helped paint walls, plant gardens, and organize food drives for families who were still struggling to recover. Baby Gale was always close by, nestled in his sling, watching the world with wide, curious eyes. The town square, once a place of rubble and sorrow, began to bloom again. New businesses opened their doors, families returned to their homes, and laughter replaced the silence that had followed the storm. One afternoon, Mary stood outside the bakery she'd helped paint, admiring the bright yellow walls. Clara waved at her from inside, a smile lighting up her face. Looks beautiful, doesn't it? Jack said, coming up behind her. Mary nodded, her heart swelling with pride. It does. Jack wrapped an arm around her shoulders. You know, you've become a bit of a local legend. Mary snorted, rolling her eyes. Oh, please. I'm serious, Jack insisted. People talk about how you gave birth in the middle of a tornado and then turned around to help rebuild the town. You're inspiring people, Mary. She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. I don't know about that. I'm just trying to keep moving forward. Jack pressed a kiss to the top of her head. And that's why you're amazing. That evening, Mary sat in the living room, holding Gale as he drifted to sleep. She looked around their rebuilt home, the walls sturdy and warm, the nursery bright and filled with love. She thought back to the storm, to the fear that had nearly broken her. It felt like a lifetime ago. We made it, little one, she whispered, kissing Gale's soft cheek. We're still here. And as the last light of day faded into night, Mary closed her eyes, feeling the gentle rise and fall of her son's breathing. The storm was over, but its memory would always stay with her, a reminder of the strength she had found in the darkest moment of her life. Together, they had survived. And together, they would thrive. The seasons passed, and with them came the slow but steady transformation of the town. The scars left by the tornado were still visible, gaps where homes once stood, trees snapped like twigs now reduced to stumps, but the spirit of the community had grown stronger. People had rebuilt not just their houses, but their relationships, their faith, and their sense of belonging. For Mary, the experience became more than survival. It became a call to action. It started quietly, conversations with neighbors, evenings spent volunteering at the community center, and offering support to other families who had experienced loss. People began to see Mary not just as a survivor, but as a beacon of strength, a person who understood their fears and frustrations because she had lived through them. Mary, you're good at this, Clara told her one afternoon as they unpacked boxes of donated supplies. They were at the town's newly rebuilt community center, where volunteers gathered daily to distribute food, clothes, and essentials to those still recovering. Good at what? Mary asked, folding a stack of blankets. Clara gave her a pointed look. At helping people. Listening to them. Making them feel like things are going to be okay. Mary laughed softly, shaking her head. I'm not doing anything special. You don't see it, Clara said, her tone firm, but everyone else does. You've got a gift, Mary. People trust you because you've been there. You walked through the worst of it and came out stronger. Mary paused, glancing at Clara. I don't feel strong, she admitted. Some days I wake up and I can still hear the wind. I see that moment when the ceiling started to peel away, and I remember how it felt, how helpless I was. Clara nodded knowingly. That's exactly why people trust you. Because you're honest about it. A few weeks later, Mary stood on the porch, Gale balanced on her hip as she watched the afternoon sun dip low on the horizon. Jack was in the yard, chatting with David about repairs to the barn, and the air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain. Mary's phone buzzed in her pocket. She shifted Gale to one arm and pulled the phone out, frowning when she saw an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. Hello. Hi, is this Mary Mitchell? A voice asked. It was a woman, clear, professional but warm. Yes, this is Mary, she replied, puzzled. Hi, Mary. My name is Lauren Willis. I'm calling from the Midwest Preparedness Initiative, a nonprofit organization that focuses on disaster preparedness and community recovery. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. No, not at all, Mary said, glancing toward Gale, who was chewing on the edge of his blanket. How can I help you? I've been following your story, Lauren continued. Your interview about surviving the tornado, it resonated with a lot of people. Stories like yours remind us of how strong communities can be even in the face of disaster. And, well, we'd like to invite you to speak at our upcoming conference on disaster resilience. Mary blinked, stunned. Speak? At a conference? Yes, Lauren said. We're bringing together community leaders, survivors, and recovery specialists to share stories and strategies for building resilience. We think your experience, your honesty and strength, could inspire so many people. Mary hesitated, the phone suddenly feeling heavy in her hand. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I'm not a public speaker. I wouldn't know what to say." "You don't have to be a polished speaker, Mary," Lauren replied gently. "People want to hear the truth. They want to hear how someone like you, an ordinary person, found strength when everything fell apart. You don't need to have all the answers. Just tell your story." Mary glanced toward the horizon, where dark clouds lingered far in the distance. Just clouds, harmless this time. She thought about the tornado, about the moment she had held Gail in her arms for the first time as the storm raged around them. "You really think my story could help people?" she asked quietly. "I know it can," Lauren replied. Jack was supportive, as always, though he looked at her with concern when she told him about the conference. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, sitting beside her at the kitchen table that evening. "You don't have to, Mary. You've already done so much." "I know," Mary replied, her voice steady. "But I think Clara was right. Maybe this is something I'm supposed to do. If my story can help someone, if it can make even one person feel less alone, then it's worth it." Jack reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You're braver than you realize, you know that?" Mary smiled faintly. "I don't feel brave. I just feel tilt." The conference took place 2 months later in a nearby city. Mary arrived with Jack and Gail, nerves fluttering in her stomach as they walked into the large, modern conference center. Banners hung from the ceiling, each one emblazoned with messages about resilience, preparedness, and hope. Mary was ushered backstage, where speakers gathered to prepare. She met others who had lived through disasters, hurricanes, floods, wildfires. Each of them carried their own stories of loss and survival, and Mary listened in quiet awe as they shared their experiences. When it was finally her turn to speak, Mary's hands shook as she stepped onto the stage. The auditorium was packed, hundreds of faces watching her expectantly. A spotlight shone down, and for a brief moment, the world felt too big, too loud. Then she spotted Jack in the front row, holding Gail in his lap. Their son's tiny face was turned toward her, his eyes wide and curious, and the sight of him filled her with a sense of calm she couldn't explain. Mary took a deep breath and began to speak. "I'm not a public speaker," she said softly, her voice carrying through the silent room. "I'm not a hero or an expert. I'm just a mom who found herself giving birth in the middle of a tornado." The audience shifted, leaning in, their expressions open and curious. "I remember the sound of the wind," Mary continued, her voice steadying. "It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, loud, angry, and unstoppable. I remember the house shaking around me, the walls bending, the ceiling breaking apart. I remember being terrified, so terrified that I thought I'd never see the world again." She paused, glancing at Gail, who gurgled softly in Jack's arms. But in the middle of all that fear, something else took over. Love for the baby I was about to meet, love for my husband, and love for the life I wasn't ready to let go of. That love gave me strength. It pushed me to fight, to keep going even when I didn't think I could. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her as she continued. "What I've learned since that day is that strength doesn't always look like we think it will. Sometimes, strength is just holding on when everything around you is falling apart. Sometimes it's asking for help when you need it. And sometimes, it's showing up for someone else who feels like they can't keep going." Mary swallowed hard, tears filling her eyes. "The tornado took my house, but it didn't take everything. It didn't take my family. It didn't take my hope. And it didn't take my belief that we can always rebuild ourselves, our homes, and our communities, if we do it together." She looked out at the audience, her voice soft but strong. "If you've been through something hard, if you're in the middle of a storm right now, I want you to know this: you're not alone. There's strength in you that you don't even know you have. And there are people who will stand beside you to help you find it." The audience erupted into applause, many people rising to their feet as Mary stepped back from the microphone. She blinked in surprise, her heart pounding as the sound filled the auditorium. Jack met her backstage, tears shining in his eyes as he handed her Gail. "You were incredible," he whispered, wrapping his arms around both of them. Mary held Gail close, pressing a kiss to his soft cheek. "I just told the truth," she murmured. "And that's why it mattered," Jack said. The weeks following the conference were a whirlwind. Messages flooded in from strangers who had seen Mary's speech online, people from all over the country who had faced their own storms, both literal and figurative. Some were survivors of natural disasters, others had battled personal tragedies, but they all shared one thing: a sense of connection to Mary's story. One message stood out. It was from a woman in Kansas who had lost everything in a tornado a year earlier. "I wanted to give up," the message read. "When I saw your story, I realized that if you could survive, so could I. Thank you for reminding me that there's hope." Mary read the words over and over, tears welling in her eyes. She never imagined that sharing her experience, her fear, her pain, and her triumph could mean so much to so many people. "You've done something amazing," Jack said one evening as they sat together on the porch, Gale sleeping soundly in his arms. "You've turned the hardest thing you ever lived through into something that helps people." Mary smiled softly, resting her head on Jack's shoulder. "It doesn't feel amazing. It just feels, right? And that's why it matters," Jack said, his voice quiet but steady. The months turned into a year, and the small town continued to heal. New homes had been built. Businesses had reopened. Gardens had been replanted, their bright blooms a testament to life and growth. The scars of the tornado remained, but they were softened now by time and resilience. On the anniversary of the storm, the town held a remembrance ceremony in the newly restored town square. The mayor spoke about loss and recovery, about the strength of their community and the love that had carried them through. Mary stood near the back of the crowd, holding Gale's tiny hand as he toddled beside her, his wide eyes taking in the scene. Jack stood on her other side, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. When the mayor finished his speech, he gestured toward Mary. "We owe a special thank you to someone whose story has inspired not only our town, but people across the country." Mary Mitchell showed us what it means to find strength in the darkest moments. "Mary, would you like to say a few words?" Mary's heart raced as the crowd turned to look at her, but this time, she didn't feel the panic she once would have. She glanced at Jack, who smiled encouragingly, and at Gale, who gripped her finger with surprising strength. Taking a deep breath, Mary stepped forward. "I don't know if I deserve all of this attention," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I'm just a mom who did what she had to do to survive." The crowd was silent, listening intently as she continued. "When the tornado came, I thought it would take everything. And in many ways, it did. It took my home. It took my sense of safety. It took the life I knew. But it didn't take everything. It didn't take my love for my family. It didn't take my hope. And it didn't take my belief that we can rebuild, no matter how broken things feel." She paused, looking out at the faces of her neighbors, friends, and strangers who had all become part of her story. "This town is proof of that," she said, gesturing to the square around them. "We've all been through something unimaginable, but we're still here. We rebuilt together, we grieved together, and we healed together. That's what makes us strong." The crowd erupted into applause, and Mary smiled, tears shining in her eyes as she stepped back toward Jack. "You were perfect," Jack whispered, wrapping his arms around her as Gale giggled softly. Mary looked around at the town square, at the people hugging and clapping, at the buildings that now stood tall and strong. It wasn't just a place, it was a symbol, a reminder of what they had survived and what they had built together. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and purple, Mary sat on the porch of their rebuilt home. Gale played in the grass nearby, his laughter carrying through the warm evening air. Jack joined her, handing her a cup of tea before settling into the chair beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, watching her as she stared at the horizon. Mary smiled, taking a slow sip of tea. "About everything," she said. "How far we've come. How much we've survived." Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on Gale as their son chased after fireflies, his tiny arms outstretched in delight. "We've been through a lot," he said. "But we made it." "We did," Mary agreed, her voice soft. "And we're stronger for it." The wind stirred gently, brushing across her face. It carried none of the malice it once had, just the faint scent of summer grass and flowers blooming in the yard. For so long, Mary had feared the wind. Its sound had haunted her, a reminder of the day her world fell apart. But now, sitting there on the porch with her family safe beside her, she realized something important. The storm had taken so much, but it had also given her something she hadn't expected: perspective. It had shown her how fragile life was, how quickly everything could change, and how strong the human spirit could be in the face of adversity. Mary looked over at Jack, who was watching Gale with a soft smile. "We're okay, aren't we?" she murmured. Jack turned to her, his eyes warm. "Yeah," he said. "We're better than okay." Mary leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment as the wind whispered through the trees. She thought of the tornado, of the chaos and the fear, of the moment she held Gale for the first time and knew she had survived. And then she thought of now, of this moment, of the love surrounding her, of the future that stretched out before them like the endless horizon. The storms would come again someday. Mary knew that. Life was unpredictable, full of challenges and loss and moments of devastation. But she also knew that she would face it all. Because she was strong. Because she was loved. And because, no matter how dark the world might become, there was always light waiting on the other side. As the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, Mary opened her eyes and watched Gale stumble toward her, his chubby arms outstretched. She scooped him up, holding him close as he giggled into her shoulder. "Time for bed, little one," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his hair. Jack stood, holding out his hand to help her up. "Come on," he said, his voice soft. "Let's go inside." Mary smiled, taking his hand and carrying Gale into their warm, sturdy home. As the door closed behind them, the wind rustled the leaves one last time, carrying with it a message Mary could finally hear. "You survived. You're still here. And you're not alone."